All right. We're continuing our study in Matthew and our walk through Matthew. Matthew chapter 8. If you would, turn to Matthew chapter 8. And at this point, I shouldn't say we're getting into the meat and potatoes of Jesus' ministry. I don't know that there was anything that was not meat and potatoes with Jesus' ministry. But in Matthew chapter 8, starting in verse 23, Jesus begins to share about the significance of peace. Before that, he went to those that were dealing with being outcast and how God's grace pours out on all of us that feel that way at one time or another. But now he begins to demonstrate and show his peace. So if you would, follow along with me as we begin reading in verse 23, and we're going to read through verse 27 this morning. Now, when he got into a boat, his disciples followed him. And suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with the waves. But he, speaking of Jesus, he was asleep. Then his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, "Lord, save us. We are perishing." But he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" Then he arose, rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, "Who can this be, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Jesus spoke a word and quieted everything down, including the fear of the disciples. And I find it puzzling, and we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. I find it puzzling that these disciples were following Jesus, but they did not fully understand who Jesus was. They were astounded by the miracle of Jesus just waking up and telling the wind and the sea to calm down. Now, I don't know if you've ever been on open water in a storm. Robin and I have when we lived in Florida, and it's quite disheartening. It's very disheartening. In order for us to really understand the impact of Jesus and the peace that he is bringing and what Matthew records in Matthew 8, I think it would be helpful for us to go to John 27. So if you would, turn to John 14, verse 27. Turn to John chapter 14 and verse 27. You know, it's so often and so frequently that we receive Jesus, we accept Jesus into our lives. And in fact, I was reminded of this again at 4:45 this morning when I got a phone call. And the person on the other end of the phone said, "I feel like God has just forsaken me." And I said, I asked, why do you feel that way? Well, because this was going on in my thinking, and I had a nightmare, and this was going on. I said, well, let me ask you one simple question. Are you still a child of God? And he says, yes, I'm still a child of God. And I said, well, show me in the Bible where it says that God is an Indian giver. And he chuckled for a minute, and he said, well, it isn't in there. And I said, okay. Then that is all you need to know. And the whole tone of the conversation changed at that point, because he understood something that he had forgotten about, and that was the fact that God, Jesus Christ, is not going to take away his salvation. So as a result of that, there was a peace that settled into his life. Now, hopefully you've reached John chapter 14, verse 27 now. Jesus has had pretty much his last meal with the disciples before his crucifixion. And he's explaining to them what was going to happen. Verse 27, Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." Now, there are some significant things that we need to understand about Jesus and the peace that he gives all of us. Not just the disciples. This is good for all of us even today, regardless of what you are facing in life, whether it is health issues, surgery, relational problems, financial problems, just the turmoil and unrest in the world around us, regardless of what it is, that does not remove the peace that we can hold on to in our everyday life. And I'm going to explain that to you. The peace that Jesus gives us and has given us is a profound, divine calmness, and also a rest within our very hearts and souls that is experienced or realized through our relationship in him. It's a gift that God's given us. Now, understanding that it is a gift that's been given to us, that means there's nothing we have to do to pay for it. There is nothing that we must do in order to be able to experience that peace. However, we do need to keep our thinking where it needs to be to keep that peace. Not that God's taken it away from us, but basically we let go of it. We let go of it and walk away from it. The peace that Jesus gives us is sought after by everybody in humanity. It's something that we desire all the time in our humanity. It is a peace that people seek out after. It's a peace that is negotiated for, just like a peace that is occurring within the world today and the battle that's going on. People are trying to find peace for it. They're trying to negotiate for that peace. Peace is something that is kept by law enforcement. They keep the peace. But no peace is lasting that man develops. No peace that man brings about is lasting. I don't recall right offhand how many thousands of peace treaties in history have been written and signed by people. The interesting thing is none of them have been kept. I could not find one peace treaty that was lasting, that man has created. Most of us, when we talk about peace, we're looking for some temporary relief. We're looking for something that is going to remove the pressure from our external life. Take away the challenges. When we speak about peace, that's what most of us look at. We want the relief from the circumstances. Warren Wiersbe described peace of Jesus Christ as a calmness and ease in the midst of a storm. In other words, when you're in the middle of a battle, when you're in the middle of turmoil, there is a calmness, a quietness, a peace that exists within your very heart that's not explainable. You can't explain it, no matter how hard you try, other than the fact that it is God's peace that is placed upon you. But understanding this peace from Jesus will also help us be able to understand the importance of the ministry that Matthew records in the miracles that Jesus performed. Remember, as we started this study and went on in Matthew, we learned that there were 3 groups of 3 miracles that Matthew recorded of Jesus demonstrating His authority and demonstrating who He is as the Son of God. But this same peace is ours, that we can hold on to each and every day. We got the word about Joel, them finding Joel unresponsive yesterday. And we knew Joel. We had dinner with him when we were visiting with Becky and Mickey, and it was heartbreaking to hear that. It was heartbreaking for Mickey because he was en route to pick up his grandsons because they were spending the summer with their mom. So he was on the road to pick grandsons up. We got word from Becky later that Mickey came home and was just perplexed because he had worked so hard to take care of Joel. Had been such a dedicated caregiver for Joel and his illness. Got him settled into a nursing home. And had just talking to Joel, and Joel was talking about how good he was doing, bragging about the weight that he had lost. And the next day he was gone. The next day the Lord had called him home. Praise God, that was the thing. He knew Jesus Christ. But there was such a peace and a calmness. Yes, there's grieving. You miss him. But there is a peace and calmness that is unexplainable. To understand this value of Jesus' message that He was demonstrating and speaking out to all of humanity and all the culture of that day, including the disciples. I feel like John 14:27 is a good place to start to understand that. So look at it here again. Peace I leave with you. Okay, Jesus makes it very clear. I'm giving you something. I'm not going to leave you have to guess at it. This is what I'm giving you. Peace. And if you remember, this was significant for the people of that day. If you remember in Matthew 6, Jesus was talking about how God was going to take care of them. They were questioning Him about their food, their clothing, all of their worldly provisions. What was going to happen to them? How would they manage? And Jesus made it very clear. He said, my Father already knows what you need. And then He said, seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. That was Jesus' response to it. So now Jesus is reminding the disciples, as well as to us, peace I leave with you. In other words, Jesus is giving us a peace. But then He says something interesting. He says, my peace I give to you. Now, that's completely different than the peace that how you and I would define peace. And it's important for us to understand that the peace is completely different. In fact, Jesus even said, it's not as the world gives you. Because, folks, the peace that the world gives us is only a temporary peace. It's only a temporary fix. I often think about, I make no beans about it, I deal with diabetes and being a type 1 diabetic and all the fun that goes with that, and neuropathy in both feet and the challenges of walking and my vision and the fun I have every month and going and getting injections in my eyes just to keep my vision. But Jesus makes it very clear that the peace I am giving you is not an external temporary fix. It is an internal experience. It is something that He is giving to us as a gift that He's already paid the price for. Therefore, we don't need to worry about losing out on it, missing out on anything. Secondly, this peace is unique and divine from God and from Jesus Christ. It transcends everything that is of this world. It goes beyond description. There is absolutely nothing that you could come up with or muster up to be able to explain at times this kind of peace. I shared with you last week about when I had my stroke several years ago. Well, when I had my TIA here, spent time in the hospital, and the hospitalist was just befuddled by the fact that I wasn't disturbed, I wasn't depressed, I wasn't upset about any of it. He just was confounded by that. And the only thing I could say to explain it is, it's Jesus. It's the fact that I know Jesus. Growing old can frustrate and confound any of us as we age, as our physical bodies begin to rebel against us and not operate the way it ought to operate. But there is a peace, a quietness, and a rest that we can only experience from Jesus. And this uniqueness of this peace was what Jesus was demonstrating as we get back into Matthew chapter 8. This is what He's demonstrating. The people of that day were looking at external relief for something that needed to be internal. And it's the same with us. We so often look for an external change for something that needs to be happening internally. Because the external change is temporary. What God does within us and within our hearts is eternal. And we need to just make that shift. And this is what Jesus is explaining to the disciples, explaining to us about this peace that He is giving to us. So it is a unique peace. It is a peace that calms our hearts and quiets the stress that the world places on us. Before Jesus shared verse 27 with the disciples, He said this in verse 1, "Let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me." You know, we could probably sit and talk about challenges and troubles that we experience in our hearts and in our lives. Any of us that are parents have experienced a troubled heart for our kids in all stages of life. And those of you who have small children, just wait till they grow up. Your prayer life will expand greatly. But that troubling heart is the peace that Jesus provides for us to quiet that heart. No external event will give us a calmness in that heart. Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 through 8 says this: "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving." Now I want you to explain something to me. How in the world could you give thanksgiving for things that are troubling you and causing you anxiety unless you had that peace from Jesus within your heart? How do you do it? Let your requests be made known to God. Verse 7. Here it is. "And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding," in other words, that is without explanation. You can go and read any book you want. I got volumes of books in my office that you could read on emotions and mental health and all of those things. But the answer is this, and Paul understood this: it is the peace of God which surpasses all understanding. Now let's put ourselves in Paul's position for a minute. Here's a man who had dedicated his early years to stopping the early church. His devotion was to get the early Christians, have them beaten, have them arrested, thrown in jail, their churches stopped, until one day he ran into a man. Well, I shouldn't say ran into him. The man just suddenly appeared. And Jesus asked him, said, "Why do you keep tormenting? Why do you keep persecuting?" Well, Paul realized that he had been wrong in his thinking. Came to Christ. But then, the ability for Paul to say what he said here comes from experiencing that peace of God within his heart. Because, remember, he'd been tormenting people. He had been throwing people in jail. Now all of a sudden he's doing just the opposite. He's going around to people and telling them about Christ. Do you honestly think that everyone that he came into contact with believed what he was doing? I'd say a lot of them probably thought that he was trying to trap them, that it was a trick. What about families of individuals that Paul had put to death? The guilt that would come over him. But because of what Paul says here, I believe that that guilt is gone, because he knew he was forgiven. Or when Paul would go into his city and they would threaten to imprison him, which they did. They would threaten to beat him, which they did. They would threaten to stone him, which they did. They even left him for dead. But Paul, in his enthusiasm, which can only come from the peace within his heart, he kept going. kept looking for opportunities that the Lord would open up for him to share with others. You know, as we have opportunity to share, as we have opportunity for ministry, as we have opportunity to reach out to the more experienced in life seniors in this town, we can take on that same attitude that Paul had. It doesn't matter how we're received. It doesn't matter how they respond to us. What matters is that we have the peace of Jesus Christ within our heart. And it gives us that enthusiasm to keep going, that drive to continue to move forward and to share. So Paul went on here, and he said in verse 7, surpasses all understanding, and will guard your heart and your minds through Christ Jesus. It is only having that peace of God that will protect our thinking. That phrase is a military term that literally means that God will garrison around your thinking and keep you safe. Depression can go away. Anxiety can leave, never to return. Worry won't even get in the door. Now, you could have every reason in the world to stew and fret on these things. But it is with the peace of God that none of them can have any effect. So Paul then goes into a time of worship in verse 8, and he starts listing off all these things. And he ends up with whatever things are praiseworthy, meditate on these things. The last thing about Paul, or about the peace of Jesus Christ, is this. This peace that we get from Jesus, that Jesus has paid the price for, is a peace that reassures us. It is an affirming peace. It is the most important. It is sufficient for everything that we need and must face in everyday life. Paul at one point was faced with physical challenges, and he asked God to heal him. 2 Corinthians 12:9, God's answer was this: my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I would rather, Paul's saying this, I would rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. It's an amazing statement. Now turn back to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8, verse 23. Now let's look once again. As Jesus was demonstrating the Son of God, as Jesus is bringing peace to people's lives that are in turmoil, that are upheavaled, that are disrupted. Well, the disciples were the good ones to start with, because he was going to send them out. And look at what happened. Now, when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And I want you to ponder this for the next week. They were following Jesus for what they saw him do. But they didn't fully understand who he was and is. That's why Psalm 46:10 to me is such an important passage. Be still and know God. Much of our struggles is because we fully do not understand our relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him, and suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea. Life's unpredictable. Tom may have a crystal ball. Did you ever have one of those crazy 8-ball things that would tell your fortune, Tom? You would shake it. Y'all remember those things? You'd shake it and turn it up, and there was a little window, and it would supposedly tell you your fortune or help you make a decision. Of course, it would all have to do with how that cube was balanced in that fluid. But we don't know what life's going to bring. We have no clue. My wife has been quite the encouragement to me. I mean, all last summer we went through hand surgeries, made the decision that she needed to have surgeries on both hands so she could continue to use them. And in January we were greeted with cancer and her having to have not one surgery but 3 surgeries to remove cancer off her face. Which I got to stop here for a minute. You are more beautiful today than the day I met you, Robin. But now we're facing yet another surgery of having to have heart surgery and having a valve repaired in her heart. But yet she doesn't sit down and woe is me. She doesn't comment, why is God doing this to me? The peace that comes is from Jesus Christ. So suddenly a great tempest arose. Now, most of these disciples were fishermen, so they were aware. It wasn't like they weren't aware of the conditions. But it had to be pretty bad to upset them and feel like they were going to sink and lose their life. So there was a great tempest that arose on the sea so that the boat was covered with the waves. In other words, they were washing over the boat. Now, if waves are washing over the boat, folks, that means some of the water is staying in the boat. Now, when Robin and I lived in South Florida and in the Keys, and we took up sailing, the one thing I learned about sailing that was very important was you could always